The courtroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes your palms sweat. It wasn't just the weight of the law that hung in the air, but the tension of something more personal, more raw. Jake Matthews, 17 years old, stood in front of Judge Harris, his heart hammering in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, but the judge's cold gaze made it hard to focus. This wasn't supposed to be how his day went, not today. "Mr. Matthews, I see you've made quite the habit of showing up here," Judge Harris sneered, tapping his gavel with exaggerated force. "Stealing food, again. You must be really desperate. I assume that's why you think you can just walk into stores and take whatever you want." The words sliced through the room like a blade. Jake's face burned. The judge's tone wasn't just stern, it was cruel, dripping with disdain. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it, the way the judge was enjoying this, relishing in his power over the young man standing before him. Jake swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears at bay. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He hadn't meant to get caught. His hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't say a word. He knew better than to argue, knew that the judge wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story. Not when he'd already decided what kind of person Jake was. "Your Honor, if I may," Jake's lawyer, Adam Cole, spoke up, his voice calm but firm, trying to steer the ship back to some semblance of fairness. "Jake is a good kid. He made a mistake. But it wasn't premeditated theft. He's been going through a lot. We'd like to discuss that before we jump to conclusions." Judge Harris's gaze flickered toward Adam, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "A good kid, huh?" The judge's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And what do you want me to do with a good kid who keeps stealing from grocery stores, Mr. Cole? Maybe we should just let him off with a slap on the wrist because he's had a tough life." The word stung. Jake felt his cheeks heat up. This wasn't just about the theft anymore, it was about everything, the life he'd been given, the choices he had to make just to survive. "Your Honor, please," Adam tried again, his voice growing more desperate. "Jake's situation is enough." Judge Harris slammed his gavel down, silencing the room. "You know what? I'm tired of this. Tired of people trying to excuse bad behavior because of a hard life. Life's hard for everyone. It's time for Mr. Matthews to face the consequences of his actions." Jake felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, sinking into his bones. It wasn't fair. He wasn't a bad person. But standing here, under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights, he felt smaller and smaller. It felt like the world had already decided who he was, and no one was willing to give him a chance. "Mr. Matthews," Judge Harris continued, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You've been arrested more than once, and you still haven't learned your lesson. Tell me, why should I believe you won't just keep stealing? What's to stop you from ending up right back here again?" Jake opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. His mind was racing, heart pounding. He knew what he'd done, but it wasn't like the judge thought. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be stuck in a cycle of crime and punishment. But what else was he supposed to do? He'd never known anything else. His mom worked 2 jobs to barely scrape by, and they lived in a neighborhood where opportunities didn't exist, only problems. He'd felt the weight of the world pressing down on him since he was a kid. Sometimes, stealing was the only way to get by. "Jake," Adam said softly, placing a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "You don't have to answer that. I'll handle it." Jake nodded, feeling a tiny sliver of relief. At least Adam was on his side. But even that didn't make the judge's words any less sharp. As Adam rose to address the court, Jake couldn't help but feel like he was invisible, as though the entire room had already decided his fate. He was the lost kid, the one who had no chance. "Your Honor," Adam said, standing tall. "I understand your concerns, but I ask that you consider Jake's background in his current situation. He doesn't have a father to guide him, and his mother is doing her best, but it's not easy. He's not a career criminal, and he's trying to do better. Jake could feel Adam's words stirring something deep inside him, a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone who believed in him. But when he looked over at Judge Harris, all he saw was cold, indifferent eyes, not even the slightest hint of compassion. "Do you hear yourself, Mr. Cole?" Judge Harris scoffed. "I'm supposed to let him off because he has a hard life? Tell me, how many people in this courtroom have had a hard life? How many people have had to scrape by, with no one giving them a second chance? Are we all just supposed to roll over and forgive bad behavior just because someone had a rough childhood?" The words were like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to close in on Jake, his vision blurring for a moment. His entire life had felt like one big mistake, one big uphill battle. It was like no one understood him, not really. The judge saw him as nothing more than a statistic, another kid who was destined to fail. "Your Honor," Adam said, his voice unwavering now, "all we're asking for is a chance. A chance for Jake to prove that he can be better than the mistakes he's made. A chance to break the cycle." For a moment, there was silence. The tension hung thick in the air, like the storm before the lightning. The judge stared at Adam, his gavel poised, ready to strike. Then, Judge Harris did something unexpected. He leaned back in his chair and studied Jake for a long, uncomfortable moment. The room waited, breath held, anticipating his next words. Jake wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what came next. It could go either way. He could either get a break, or it could all come crashing down. "You're right, Mr. Cole," Judge Harris finally said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Maybe it's time to hear the whole story. But don't think for a second that I'm just going to let him off the hook. Life doesn't work that way." Jake felt the weight of the judge's words sink in. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The courtroom was still, but Jake felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake Matthews had never been given a fair shot. That was the truth of it. He had been born into a world that didn't care about second chances, a world that demanded results without offering any kind of help. He wasn't born into a loving home with a white picket fence, or a father who coached him on how to throw a football or teach him how to drive. No, Jake was raised in a rundown apartment in a part of town where hope was something you only heard about in stories. His mom, Lisa Matthews, was all he had, and she had worked tirelessly to make sure he never went hungry. But even she was stretched too thin. She worked double shifts at a local diner, barely scraping by to cover rent, utilities, and the few other bills they had. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. There were always more bills, always more costs that came up. And every month, it felt like they were getting pushed farther and farther into a corner. Jake could remember the nights when his mom would come home from work exhausted, her eyes red from crying after the night shift. She'd try to hide it, put on a smile, but he knew. He always knew. She was doing everything she could, but it felt like she was fighting a losing battle. When Jake was just a kid, his father left. He didn't leave in a dramatic way, no shouting or throwing things, just one day, he was gone. No explanation, no note, nothing. Just a sudden void where his dad used to be. For years, Jake tried to make sense of it, but the truth was, he didn't have answers. His father was just a ghost, a name he heard stories about from his mom when she was drunk or tired or both. Jake's friends at school didn't understand. They had two parents who were around, who had money to go on vacations and send them to private lessons. He didn't have any of that. His friends would complain about things like their parents being too overbearing or their private tutors giving them too much homework. Jake didn't even know what it was like to feel safe, to feel secure. He was always on edge, always worried about whether the electricity would stay on or if they'd have enough to eat by the end of the week. He started acting out in school. Not because he was a bad kid, but because the frustration and confusion of his life had nowhere else to go. He was just a kid, but it felt like the world had already decided who he was, just another statistic, another teenager destined to fall through the cracks. The teachers didn't understand, either. They just saw the guy who skipped class, the guy who barely passed, the guy who didn't have a father to help him with his homework or guide him through life. His best friend, Mark, tried to be supportive, but Mark had his own problems. His parents were too busy working to pay attention to him either. They were in the same boat, but it didn't make Jake feel any less alone. They would hang out after school, doing whatever they could to kill time, sometimes doing stupid things, like smoking behind the gym or getting into trouble just for the sake of it. But it wasn't the kind of trouble that felt good. It was a desperate kind of trouble. It was the kind of trouble where you felt like you had no other choice but to try to escape. To numb the constant worry, the constant weight of it all. One day, when Jake was 15, he took his first step into the world of petty crime. It was a simple thing, really. He'd been walking home from school one day when he noticed a group of kids hanging around a local convenience store. They were joking, laughing, and passing a bottle of something between them. Jake had walked past them once, but something in his gut told him to turn around. He went back, feeling a strange pull, a pull to just be part of something, even if it was just for a few minutes. That was when he made his first mistake. He didn't take much, just a bag of chips and a couple of candy bars. But when he stepped out of the store, the clerk saw him. He didn't know what to do, so he ran. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. When he got home, he shoved the candy under his bed, telling himself it didn't matter. He was just hungry. He'd made a mistake, but it wasn't like he'd hurt anyone. He didn't mean to steal. It was just a moment of weakness, just a way to escape from everything that was going wrong in his life. But the problem was that one mistake turned into another, and then another. Over time, the small thefts added up. A few cans of soda here, some snacks there. Each time, it felt like the world got a little quieter. But Jake didn't realize it, not until it was too late, that he was becoming something he never wanted to be. A kid who relied on stealing to get by. His mom caught him once, when she found a bag of stolen goods in his backpack. The disappointment in her eyes was enough to make him sick. He tried to explain himself, tried to tell her that he didn't know what else to do, but her silence hurt more than her words could have. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. She just stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time, and in that moment, Jake felt like a failure. His mom's face was a reflection of everything he feared about himself, lost, broken, and powerless. But the cycle didn't stop. It couldn't. Jake didn't know how to escape it. His actions started catching up with him, but he was too far gone. And by the time he ended up in this courtroom, standing before a judge who saw him as nothing more than a lost cause, he'd already resigned himself to the fact that his life was going to be a series of mistakes that could never be undone. The judge had no idea what it was like. He had no idea what it meant to fight for something, to scrape and claw just to stay afloat. All the judge saw was a kid who'd made a few wrong choices, but those choices didn't define him. At least, not completely. Jake tried to remember that as he stood there in front of Judge Harris. He tried to remember that he wasn't just a mistake. He wasn't just a statistic. But sometimes, it felt like the world had already written his story, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The courtroom felt suffocating now. Jake could feel the eyes of the people in the room on him, judging, evaluating, dissecting every little detail of who he was. The words, "repeat offender," hung in the air, heavier than any gavel could strike. The air was thick with tension as the judge's final remarks from earlier still lingered in Jake's mind. This wasn't just about a stolen snack or a quick grab for some soda anymore. No, this was about a bigger picture, a picture that Jake couldn't quite see yet, but felt the weight of pressing down on his chest. Adam Cole, his lawyer, was pacing in front of the judge's bench, his hands clasped in front of him. He was trying, desperately, to get through to Judge Harris. Jake's future was in the balance, and Adam was doing everything in his power to keep that future from getting shattered. "Your Honor, I know the law demands consequences for theft," Adam began, his voice steady and unwavering, though Jake could sense the fatigue beneath the surface. "But we're asking for a different kind of punishment. We're not trying to minimize Jake's actions, but I beg you to consider his circumstances." Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Adam was his advocate, his voice in this terrifying sea of legal jargon and courtroom drama. But as much as Jake wanted to believe that Adam could convince the judge, the harsh reality was that Judge Harris had already made up his mind. Jake could see it in his eyes. "I've heard enough, Mr. Cole," Judge Harris interrupted, his tone cold and dismissive. "Your client is a repeat offender. This is not a matter of circumstances, it's a matter of choice. And frankly, I don't see any reason why I should believe that he won't be standing in this courtroom again next week." Jake felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. His stomach churned as the words from the judge continued to echo in his mind. Repeat offender. Won't learn his lesson. No one seemed to care that he was trying to make sense of a world that hadn't offered him anything except struggle and survival. "Your Honor, I implore you to look at the bigger picture here," Adam said, now turning to face Jake, his voice softening. "Jake is not a bad person. He is a good kid who's been dealt a hard hand in life. He's trying to break free from the cycle he's been caught in. But he needs help, not punishment." Jake's eyes dropped to the floor. "He needs help," Adam had said. But did he? Did he really? Or had he just been telling himself that over and over again to excuse the things he'd done? He didn't even know anymore. "What would you have me do then, Mr. Cole?" Judge Harris asked, his tone turning sarcastic now, as though the request for leniency was beneath him. "Put him in therapy for a few months and then just let him go back to doing whatever he wants. What will that solve?" The question was like a punch in the gut. It was clear to Jake that Judge Harris wasn't going to give him any slack. His heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He couldn't see a way out. All his life, he had been told he wasn't enough, by his father, by society, by his own actions. And now, standing in this courtroom, it felt like everyone was confirming that. "Jake," Adam said, his voice lower, more direct, as if sensing Jake's turmoil, "you've been given a chance to make this right. But the road to redemption doesn't come easy. It requires action, and it requires us to face the hard truths. Now's your moment." The words were meant to inspire him, but they felt like an ultimatum, another weight on his shoulders. What action was Adam talking about? What hard truth was he supposed to face? That he didn't deserve a second chance. That all his past mistakes were going to follow him forever. The judge sighed audibly, leaning forward in his chair, hands steepled in front of his face. "Let's get this straight. Mr. Matthews, you've had your chance. I'm not here to babysit a troubled teen. I'm here to uphold the law. And in my court, the law is clear." He slammed his gavel down for emphasis. The law doesn't make excuses for people who can't follow the rules. Jake could feel his insides twist. He had never been great at keeping his emotions in check, especially when it felt like the entire world was against him. But something snapped in that moment, a desperate need to prove that he wasn't just another screw-up, another case number on a long list. He wasn't just another lost kid. "Your Honor," Jake finally spoke up, his voice shaky but clear. The room fell silent, everyone turning their gaze toward him. He didn't care if he messed up his words, didn't care if the judge would mock him again. He just had to say it. He had to try. "I'm not a bad person. I just don't know what else to do. I've made mistakes, yeah, but I'm trying to do better. I don't want to keep screwing up. I don't want to end up like my dad. Please." The last word hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a brief moment, Jake felt a flicker of something different. Something other than shame. It wasn't much, but it was there, a shred of truth, of honesty, that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't let anyone see before. The judge's eyes narrowed as he stared at Jake. It was as if the words hadn't hit him immediately, but then, slowly, they seemed to sink in. For the first time, Judge Harris didn't immediately retort with some snide comment or dismissive remark. He seemed to pause, almost as though considering something, but Jake couldn't tell what. The silence was oppressive. Adam, sensing an opening, spoke up once more. "Your Honor, we ask for an alternative sentencing. A chance for Jake to prove he can turn things around with the right support. Sometime in a rehabilitation program." "No," Judge Harris snapped, shaking his head. "I'm not about to let this kid walk free with a slap on the wrist." "But," he continued, his voice suddenly shifting. "I'll tell you what, Mr. Cole. I'm willing to give him a chance. One more chance." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "A diversion program," Judge Harris said slowly, almost as if considering the words before he said them. "But it's going to be strict. And if he steps out of line again, he's done. And I mean it." The words hit Jake like a punch. A chance. This was it. His one shot. One more opportunity to prove he wasn't lost. But the road ahead was still unclear, still littered with obstacles he didn't know how to navigate. The judge leaned back in his chair, finishing with a final warning: "You better not waste it, Mr. Matthews. Because if you do, the next time I see you in my courtroom, it'll be your last." The days that followed Jake's court appearance felt like a blur, like he was stuck in a fog, unable to move forward or backward. He'd been granted a chance, yes, but that's all it was. A chance. A single shot at redemption, and the weight of it was starting to sink in. Jake spent the next few days thinking about what the judge had said. "Don't waste it." The words replayed in his mind like a broken record. He knew, deep down, that his life had come to a crossroads. He could keep spiraling down the same path, making the same mistakes, living in that cycle of destruction. Or, he could grab hold of this chance with both hands and try to turn things around, no matter how hard it was. The rehabilitation program he'd been sentenced to was not what he'd expected. When Adam had first mentioned it, Jake had imagined something like a few group therapy sessions or a couple of workshops on anger management. But it was so much more than that. It was a 12-week program, designed to force him to confront not only his actions but his mindsets and the emotional baggage he'd carried for years. It was about self-awareness, building responsibility, and changing the way he viewed himself and his choices. At first, Jake resented it. Every session felt like a challenge. He didn't want to be there, sitting in a circle with other teens, some of them worse off than him, some with backgrounds even darker than his own. It felt like a punishment, an extension of the sentence he was already serving. Why should he be stuck in this room with kids who had more issues than he did? He wasn't like them. He wasn't a lost cause. The first few days were full of resistance. Jake would sit with his arms crossed, staring at the floor, barely participating. The program's counselor, a woman named Linda, seemed to understand the struggle. She didn't push too hard, but every time Jake tried to withdraw, she'd gently pull him back in. "You don't have to say anything," she'd tell him. "But I want you to think about what you're afraid of. Why do you feel like you're here?" Jake would never answer. He didn't even know how to begin. He didn't want to admit what he was afraid of, not to her, not to anyone. Because the truth was, the thing he feared most wasn't the court sentence, wasn't the program, wasn't even his mother's disappointment. No, Jake feared that he wasn't capable of change. He feared that deep down, he was exactly what everyone else thought he was, a screw-up with no chance of redemption. But Linda didn't let him off the hook that easily. She would press him gently, softly, but never in a way that felt like she was judging him. Over time, the other kids in the group started to open up, slowly sharing their own stories. It was awkward at first, but as they began to speak, Jake realized something startling: they weren't all that different from him. They all had stories that were marked by pain, regret, or feelings of abandonment. Maybe they hadn't been born into a loving home like some of his classmates, or maybe they'd been given up on by their families or society, just like him. One day, something happened that Jake wasn't prepared for. During a group session, a kid named Luke, who had been quiet up until then, spoke out. "I've done some messed up stuff, you know," Luke said, his voice breaking. "And I don't know why I keep doing it. I know it's wrong. But sometimes, it feels like it's the only way I can feel like I'm in control of my life. If I don't act out, then I'm not really living, you know." The room went silent. Jake found himself staring at Luke, thinking about how much that statement mirrored his own experience. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this after all. Linda gave Luke a reassuring smile. "That's the first step, Luke," she said softly. "Admitting that you're stuck is the first step to breaking free. And you're not alone in this." Jake's mind whirred. Luke's words rang true in a way that Jake hadn't expected. He wasn't acting out just to hurt people or be a troublemaker. He was acting out because it was the only way he knew how to exist, how to feel alive. "Wasn't that what I've been doing too?" Jake thought. As the weeks wore on, something in Jake began to shift. It wasn't an instant transformation. There were still days when he felt angry and frustrated, still days when he wanted to scream that this whole program was a waste of time. But slowly, he started to listen more during sessions. He started to talk, tentatively at first, but then with more openness. The walls he'd spent years building around himself started to crack. One of the most difficult parts of the program was a journal exercise that Linda had assigned. She asked each of them to write about a moment in their life when they felt most helpless, when they had given up on themselves. The idea was to confront those moments head-on, to understand what had caused them, and to start to take responsibility for the way they'd reacted to those moments. Jake had avoided the exercise at first. He didn't want to relive the worst parts of his life: the day his father left, the countless nights of hunger, the constant worry about how his mom was doing, about how he was doing. But one night, after hours of tossing and turning, Jake grabbed a notebook and began to write. He wrote about the time he'd stolen his first bag of chips, about how the feeling of rebellion had been mixed with guilt, but also with relief. He wrote about the weight of his mother's disappointment when she found out, the way it felt like a knife to his chest. And he wrote about the feeling of being invisible, like he didn't matter to anyone, not even to himself. The more Jake wrote, the clearer things became. The anger, the self-destructive choices, they had all come from a place of feeling unseen, unimportant. The only way he knew how to cope was to act out, to take what wasn't his because it was the only time he felt like he had any control over his life. And in that moment, Jake realized something that he hadn't fully understood before. He could change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but it was possible. The power had always been inside of him, he just hadn't known how to use it. As he wrote the final lines of his journal entry, Jake felt a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't cured. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. The next day, when it was time to share in the group, Jake hesitated. But when his turn came, he spoke. He spoke about his father, his mistakes, his mom, and how he was learning to take responsibility for his actions. The group was silent as they listened, and for the first time, Jake didn't feel like a freak. He didn't feel like the only one who couldn't get it right. He felt like he was part of something bigger, a community of people who were all trying to find their way. And in that moment, Jake understood that this wasn't just about avoiding jail time. It wasn't just about checking off a box for the court. This was about his life. This was about proving to himself that he could be more than his past. But as Jake left the session that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder before they got better. A storm was coming. Jake hadn't expected things to get better overnight. He knew that change, especially the kind he was trying to make, wasn't easy. But the further he went into the rehabilitation program, the more the weight of his actions seemed to bear down on him. He was learning to confront the darker parts of his past, to see himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who could take responsibility for the choices he made. But that didn't make it any easier. His relationship with his mom, for example, was still rocky. Every time he tried to talk to her about how he was feeling, it felt like she was caught between hope and resignation. She wanted to believe in him, she truly did, but the years of disappointment had taken their toll. One evening, after a particularly tough therapy session, Jake walked home alone. He could feel the cold biting at his skin, the tension in his chest as his thoughts raced. He had to face it. He had to face her. They needed to talk. He needed her to understand that he wasn't just the screw-up she had come to expect. As he opened the door to their small apartment, he was hit with the smell of cooking dinner, spaghetti, his mom's favorite. He was suddenly overcome with a wave of guilt. Here she was, working hard to make ends meet, trying to hold everything together while he was doing his best to tear it apart. "Hey, Mom," Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. He saw her turn from the stove, her tired eyes brightening when she saw him. "Oh, hey, sweetie, how was your day?" she asked, her voice still holding a touch of warmth, despite the stress that always seemed to hang over her. Jake wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to tell her that he was trying, that he was learning to see himself differently, that he wasn't as lost as he had been. But the words got stuck in his throat. Instead, he just shrugged. It was fine. Therapy was all right. We did this exercise where we talked about our past. His mom nodded, placing the spaghetti on the table. "That's good. It sounds like you're making progress." Jake couldn't help but feel the sting of those words. Progress. How much progress had he really made? How much of his past could he ever really leave behind? He took a seat at the table, his stomach twisting as his mom sat down opposite him. The silence stretched out between them, thick and uncomfortable. It was a silence they both had gotten used to over the years. Jake knew she wanted to ask him more, to press him for answers, but she didn't know how. She was scared to push too hard, scared of what he might say or how he might react. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "Jake, I know it's been hard. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Even when you make mistakes, even when I don't know what to do or how to help, I'm proud of you. And I'll always be here." The words hit Jake like a punch. Proud of me? He had always thought she was just saying that because she had to. But there, in her eyes, he saw something different. She meant it. And that, more than anything, made him feel both embarrassed and grateful at the same time. Jake's eyes stung, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He wanted to tell her everything, that he was sorry for all the times he had let her down, that he was finally realizing what it meant to care, to really care. But instead, he just nodded, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. I know, Mom," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying. I really am." She smiled softly, her eyes softening as she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I know you are. Just keep trying. That's all anyone can do." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he wasn't alone in this journey. She still believed in him. And maybe, just maybe, he could believe in himself, too. But just as Jake thought he might begin to feel a sense of peace, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, expecting a message from one of his friends, maybe a quick check-in, but when he saw the name on the screen, his heart dropped. It was a message from the court. He opened it with shaking hands, his mind racing. "Jake, this is a reminder that you are scheduled for your next court appearance in 2 weeks. This hearing will determine your eligibility for the alternative sentencing program. Please be prepared to demonstrate your progress and commitment. The message was blunt, and yet it hit Jake like a freight train. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. If he didn't prove he was making enough progress, if he didn't convince the court that he was turning things around, all of this, the therapy, the small steps forward, could be for nothing. It could all be erased in an instant. His stomach twisted as he read the message over and over. He wasn't ready for this. He didn't know if he was ready to stand before a judge again, to face the weight of his past and try to prove that he wasn't just another lost cause. "Jake, what is it?" his mom asked, her voice full of concern as she saw the look on his face. He glanced up at her, his eyes wide with panic. I have a court hearing in 2 weeks. They're going to decide if I can stay in the program, or if they'll send me to juvie." The words came out in a rush, and before he could stop them, his emotions erupted. "What if I'm not ready, Mom? What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm just lying to get out of trouble? What if I mess this up again?" Tears filled his eyes, and he felt utterly powerless. The pressure of the moment, the fear that he hadn't changed enough, that it wouldn't be enough, was overwhelming. His mom stood up and walked over to him, kneeling down beside his chair. She gently cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Jake," she said softly but firmly, "you've come so far already. You've done things I never thought you could. This isn't about being perfect. This is about showing them, and yourself, that you're willing to fight for a better future." Jake nodded, his heart heavy. He wasn't sure if he believed her completely, but her words filled him with a sense of hope, a glimmer of something brighter than the darkness he had been living in. "I'm with you, Jake," she added, squeezing his hand. "Every step of the way." As Jake sat there, feeling the weight of the upcoming hearing on his shoulders, he realized something. The road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know how things would end up in the courtroom. But he knew this, he wasn't going through it alone anymore. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. The days leading up to Jake's court hearing felt like they were crawling by. Each morning, he woke up with the weight of the impending decision hanging over him. It wasn't just the fear of what would happen if the judge decided he wasn't ready for the alternative sentencing program. No, it was the fear of failing once again, of having to face his mother's disappointment, of proving to everyone that he was exactly what they thought he was, a screw-up. Jake had been making progress. He knew that. His days in the rehab program had been tough, but slowly, he had started to feel like a different person. He was more aware of his actions, more conscious of how his choices affected the people around him. But the question still lingered, would the judge see that? Would anyone believe he was truly changing? On the morning of the hearing, Jake stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He looked different somehow, though he wasn't sure if it was the clean-cut look he had been trying to maintain or if it was something deeper, something that came from within. His old self, the rebellious teenager who always acted out to get attention, was still there, but he felt more distant now. He wasn't sure if it was the program working, or the long talks with his mom, or the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he had thought. But whatever it was, he could feel the change. "Jake, you ready?" his mom called from the kitchen, her voice soft but tinged with nerves. He took one last look at himself, took a deep breath, and nodded to his reflection, trying to reassure himself. "I can do this. I'm ready," he said, though the words felt hollow. His mom was sitting at the kitchen table, nervously stirring her coffee. She looked up as he entered the room, her face a mixture of worry and pride. "You know, you've come a long way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is scary. But you've done everything you could. I'm proud of you." Jake gave her a small smile, though his heart wasn't in it. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But today was the day when all of his progress would be tested. The drive to the courthouse felt longer than it actually was. The streets were familiar, but today, everything felt different, more distant, more serious. He was about to walk into that courtroom and face the consequences of his actions. And if he wasn't convincing enough, it could mean more time in juvenile detention. They arrived at the courthouse, and Jake's stomach flipped as they parked. His mom reached out to touch his arm before he could open the door. "Jake, whatever happens in there, I want you to know something. You've already proven to me that you can change. Just remember that, okay?" He nodded, but the words felt heavy. It wasn't just about proving anything to her anymore. It was about proving it to himself. Inside the courthouse, the air was tense. The walls were cold and sterile, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls as they made their way to the courtroom. Jake's nerves were on edge as they sat in the waiting area. His mother was sitting beside him, but Jake couldn't focus on anything but the pounding in his chest. Finally, the doors to the courtroom opened, and a clerk called out his name. Jake stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked into the room. The judge, Judge Roberts, was sitting at the front, looking as stern as ever. His eyes didn't leave Jake as he walked to the stand. His mom sat down behind him, her hand placed firmly on his shoulder for support. Jake felt like a fish out of water, unsure of what to do with himself. He had been in court before, but this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't just there to plead his case. He was there to change his future. Judge Roberts glanced at his file and then looked back at Jake. "Jake, it's been a few weeks since we last spoke. I see that you've been attending the rehabilitation program. Tell me, how do you feel you're progressing?" Jake opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get stuck. He had rehearsed this in his head a million times, but now that he was here, it was harder than he had imagined. I think I'm getting better," Jake said, his voice shaky. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I've been trying. I've been working on myself, on understanding why I do the things I do, and trying to make better choices." Judge Roberts raised an eyebrow, not convinced. "That's a good start, Jake. But I need more than just words. I need to see that you're truly committed to turning things around. What's been the hardest part of this process for you?" Jake paused, thinking back on all the therapy sessions, the journal exercises, the moments when he felt like giving up. "The hardest part," he began slowly, "has been facing the truth about myself. I've spent so long pretending everything was someone else's fault, blaming my past, blaming my situation. But, it's not anyone else's fault. It's mine. And that's the hardest part, accepting that." The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Jake's heart raced as he wondered if that answer was enough. The judge didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened just a fraction. He glanced over at the prosecutor, who was seated to the side, and then back at Jake. "I can appreciate that honesty, Jake. But I need to hear more. You're not here just to tell me that you're trying. I need to know that you understand the gravity of the situation. You need to prove that you've made progress, that you've learned from your mistakes. Are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" Jake's throat tightened as the weight of those words sank in. "I am," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm ready to take responsibility. I want to prove that I'm not just a kid who makes mistakes. I want to show that I can be more than that. I can be someone who changes." The judge nodded, tapping his fingers on the desk as he studied Jake for a moment. The silence in the room felt like it stretched on forever. Finally, Judge Roberts spoke. "All right, Jake. I'm going to give you a chance. You've shown that you're willing to do the work, and I believe that with continued effort, you can make progress. But know this is your final opportunity. If you fail to live up to your commitments, if you fail to stay on track, the consequences will be severe." Jake's heart skipped a beat as the words hit him. This was it. He had been given a chance, but it was up to him to prove that he was worth it. "Thank you, Your Honor," Jake said, his voice full of determination. The judge nodded, and with a final glance at Jake, he turned to the court clerk. Let's adjourn this hearing. As the gavel slammed down, Jake felt a rush of emotions. Relief, yes, but also fear. The real work was just beginning. Jake couldn't remember the last time he felt so many emotions all at once. Walking out of the courtroom, his knees felt like jelly, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down on his chest like a 1,000-pound rock. But it wasn't all bad. He had done it. He had faced the judge, stood his ground, and actually convinced the court to give him a chance. His mom, sitting beside him, was practically glowing with pride, her eyes shining as she whispered, "You did it, Jake. You did it." He wanted to smile, wanted to share in her excitement, but his mind kept replaying the judge's final words, "This is your last chance." Those words haunted him. The path ahead was filled with uncertainty. What if he stumbled? What if he failed again? It would all be over. "Jake, are you okay?" His mom's voice brought him back to the present. He looked at her and gave a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, a lot to think about." "I know, sweetie. But you're going to be okay. One day at a time, right?" Jake nodded, but the doubt still lingered. The courtroom may have given him a second chance, but he wasn't sure he believed in himself yet. He had to prove himself. And proving himself wasn't going to be easy. As they made their way to the car, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from his therapist, Sarah, reminding him about the upcoming group session. He was supposed to go every week, but this time, the message felt different. This time, he had to be prepared. The session wasn't just about talking through feelings, it was about showing that he was serious about this whole, turning his life around, thing. "I'll go," Jake muttered, staring at his phone. "What, honey?" his mom asked, already buckled in as she started the car. "The group therapy session," Jake replied. "I have one this week. It's important. I think I need it more than I realize." His mom nodded. "Good. I'm glad you're still going. You've come so far already, Jake. Don't forget that." As the car sped down the highway, the world outside seemed to blur. The trees, the buildings, the passing cars, all of it felt distant, as though Jake was watching it from a place far removed. He wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the court hearing or the overwhelming feeling of hope that was clouding his mind. Either way, he knew one thing for sure, his life was about to change. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. The next day, Jake sat nervously in the waiting room of the Rehabilitation Center. The walls were decorated with bright, calming colors, but all he could focus on was the weight in his chest. His mind kept circling back to the hearing. Was he really ready for this? Was he really ready to change? He wasn't sure. The door to the therapy room opened, and Sarah, his therapist, stood there with a welcoming smile. "Jake, come on in. We're starting in a few minutes." Jake stood up slowly and walked toward the door, trying to keep his legs from shaking. Sarah led him to a chair across from her desk. It was a small room with soft lighting, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to breathe. He had been in and out of therapy for years, but this time, something felt different. This time, he was here because he wanted to be. He was here because he had a real chance at turning his life around, and that scared him more than anything. "So," Sarah said as she sat down across from him, "how are you feeling today?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say. Should he lie and say he was fine? Or should he admit that the court hearing had left him feeling more uncertain than ever? "I don't know," he said finally, looking down at his hands. "It's like I got what I wanted. The judge gave me a chance. But I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know if I can really change. What if I mess it up?" Sarah nodded, her expression gentle but firm. Jake, change is hard. And it's not something that happens overnight. The fact that you're here, sitting in front of me, already shows that you're taking it seriously. It shows that you're committed to making progress, even if you don't have all the answers yet. Jake felt a small flicker of hope, but the fear still gnawed at him. But what if I fail again? We're all going to make mistakes, Jake. It's a part of the process. What matters is how you respond to those mistakes. Do you let them define you? Or do you learn from them and keep going? Her words sank in, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was starting to understand. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, learning, and growing. It was about showing up every day, even when things got tough. I'll try, he said quietly, a sense of determination settling in. I'll try, Sarah. I don't want to mess this up. That's all anyone can do, Sarah replied, her voice filled with encouragement. One step at a time. The days following the hearing were a blur. Jake spent most of his time either at the rehab center or attending his court-mandated therapy sessions. He was busy, but in a way, it felt good. It felt like he was finally doing something with his life instead of just floating through it. The work wasn't easy, and there were days when he wanted to give up, days when the old habits seemed to creep back in. But he kept reminding himself, this was his chance. His one shot at turning things around. His mom was supportive, as always, but even she seemed to know how much pressure he was under. Jake caught her looking at him sometimes with that mix of love and worry in her eyes, as if she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. He hated that look. He hated the idea that she still doubted him, but he also knew that he had to prove to her, and to himself, that he was capable of more. One afternoon, as Jake was leaving his therapy session, he received a text from one of his friends, Ethan, who he hadn't heard from in a while. Yo, Jake. We're throwing a party this weekend. You should come through. It'll be fun, man. You can finally let loose. The text made Jake pause. The old him would have jumped at the chance to go, drink, party, forget about everything for a while. But the new Jake. The one trying to stay on track. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He didn't know if he could handle being in that environment again without slipping back into his old ways. His thumb hovered over the screen, torn between two choices. Part of him wanted to go, to feel like he was still connected to his old life. But another part of him knew that going could undo everything he had worked so hard for. He typed back a simple response, thanks, but I'm good. Maybe next time. As soon as he hit send, Jake felt a sense of relief. He had made a choice, his choice, and that felt good. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, Jake was ready to walk it. Jake wasn't sure what had changed inside him, but something felt different after he turned down Ethan's party invitation. It wasn't just the fact that he'd made the decision to stay clean, stay focused. It was more than that, it was like he'd taken a small step into a new version of himself. He wasn't exactly sure who this new Jake was, but the fact that he had made a choice without the usual self-doubt or fear made him feel a little stronger. The next few days passed quietly. Jake stayed focused on his therapy sessions, attending group discussions and one-on-one meetings with Sarah. But no matter how much he worked on himself, the shadow of his past still loomed over him. The people he'd hurt, the bad choices he'd made, it was hard to escape it. One afternoon, Jake found himself sitting in his room, trying to distract himself with some homework. The work wasn't challenging, but his mind wandered back to the events of the last few weeks. The court hearing, the therapy sessions, the constant weight of feeling like he was constantly being tested. A knock on his door broke his train of thought. It was his mom. Jake, can we talk for a minute? She asked, her voice quiet, but there was a hint of something more beneath her calm demeanor. Jake sat up, his chest tightening. He could tell by the look on her face that this wasn't just about asking if he'd finished his homework. Yeah, of course, he replied, trying to sound casual, though he had no idea what this was about. His mom sat down on the edge of his bed, her eyes searching his face. "You're doing great with everything. I can see how hard you're trying, and I'm proud of you. But, there's something I've been thinking about. And I want you to hear me out, okay?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath. "It's about your dad." Jake stiffened at the mention of his father. His dad had always been a complicated subject. There were moments when he wished his dad had been a better role model, but then there were times when he just felt angry at him for not being there when Jake needed him most. Their relationship had always been strained. When Jake was younger, his dad had been absent, emotionally and physically, caught up in his own world, his own problems. And that left Jake and his mom to pick up the pieces. "I know you don't like talking about him, but I think it's time we had that conversation," his mom continued, her voice soft but insistent. "He's been reaching out. And I know it's a touchy subject, but I think it might help if you at least hear him out. Maybe it's time for some closure." Jake stared at her, trying to process the words. The last thing he wanted was to face his dad. He hadn't heard from him in years, and the thought of reconnecting made his stomach churn. He was in a better place now. He didn't need to dredge up those old feelings of resentment and abandonment. He had enough to deal with. "I don't know, Mom," Jake said slowly. "I don't think I'm ready for that. I've been through so much already, and I don't want him coming back into my life like nothing happened." His mom nodded, understanding. "I get it. But you don't have to make any decisions right now. I just think it's important that you know he's trying. He's been sober for a while now, and he wants to meet. I'm not pushing you, Jake. I just don't want you to close that door forever without thinking about it." Jake felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to scream and tell his mom that he didn't need his dad to be a part of his life. But another part of him felt a flicker of curiosity. Could his dad actually be trying to change? Could they really have a conversation that wasn't filled with anger and disappointment? "I'll think about it," Jake said finally, even though the last thing he wanted was to think about it at all. But his mom smiled, kissed his forehead, and left the room, leaving him with the thoughts of a father he had long since given up on. The next day, Jake went to group therapy, but his mind was elsewhere. Sarah had noticed his distraction, but she didn't push him. Instead, she waited for him to speak when he was ready. The group was talking about progress, about taking the small steps that added up to meaningful change. But all Jake could think about was his dad's sudden reappearance. Why now? Why after all this time? After the group session, Sarah called Jake into her office for a private meeting. She had an uncanny way of knowing when something was off, and today was no exception. "Jake, I can tell something's on your mind," she said, sitting down across from him. "You've been distracted all session." Jake sighed and leaned back in the chair, rubbing his forehead. "It's my dad. He's been trying to reach me." Sarah nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "And how do you feel about that?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I don't want to talk to him. I've spent so many years resenting him for not being there for me. And now he wants to come back into my life. It just feels like too much." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Jake, I get that this is difficult. It's painful. But part of healing, true healing, is learning to confront the past, not run from it. And that doesn't mean you have to forgive him right away or even let him back in, but maybe talking to him could be part of your healing process." Jake shook his head, feeling overwhelmed. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. I've been doing so well lately. I don't want to mess it all up by letting him in." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "I hear you. But healing isn't about perfection. It's about making choices that are right for you. And sometimes, those choices are hard. You're not obligated to do anything you're not ready for, Jake. But think about it. Give yourself permission to feel whatever you need to feel before you make a decision. Jake stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. He wanted to do the right thing, to move forward, but he was terrified of falling backward, of opening himself up to someone who had hurt him so deeply. "Thanks, Sarah," he said finally. "I'll think about it." The next few days were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Jake continued to attend his therapy sessions, continued to stay focused on his work, but he couldn't shake the thought of his dad trying to reach out. Would it be worth it to hear him out? Could there be a chance for reconciliation? But as he walked down the path to recovery, Jake realized something important. This wasn't just about his dad. This was about him. It was about learning to face the tough parts of his past and using them to grow. It was about taking control of his life, one decision at a time. And that, Jake knew, was the hardest part of all. Jake woke up earlier than usual that morning, his mind restless with thoughts he couldn't shake. The decision about his dad had been gnawing at him for days. He had avoided it as long as he could, but now, it was unavoidable. The message his mom had passed along about his dad's attempts to reach out was still echoing in his mind. He couldn't tell if he was ready to face his father, but one thing was clear: avoiding it wouldn't make the feelings go away. Jake had spent years building walls around himself, walls to protect him from pain. But now, in therapy and in the quiet of his own thoughts, he was beginning to realize that maybe the walls weren't helping. Maybe they were holding him back. The weight of this realization pushed him out of bed. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and stared at it for a long moment. There was a message from his mom. She was checking in again about the situation with his dad. Jake had told her he'd think about it, but every time he thought he had made up his mind, the emotions clouded his judgment again. He typed a response to her: "Maybe we should meet. I'll give him a chance to talk." His heart pounded as he pressed send, unsure of what would happen next. Was he really ready for this conversation? His palms were sweaty as he sat on the edge of his bed, his mind still racing. Later that afternoon, Jake found himself standing in front of his father's apartment building, unsure of what to expect. He hadn't been here in years, not since the day his dad walked out of his life for good. The place seemed smaller now, almost sad in its unkempt condition. There were piles of old newspapers in the hallway, and the lights flickered above him as he waited. Taking a deep breath, Jake pushed open the door and stepped inside. He didn't know what he was feeling: anger, curiosity, confusion. Maybe all of it. But most of all, he felt afraid. As he made his way to his dad's door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was no going back after this. He knew that whatever happened, the past would be dragged into the light, and he had no idea how either of them would handle it. The door opened slowly, and standing before him was the man who had once been his hero and then his biggest disappointment. "Jake." His father's voice sounded rough, as though he hadn't used it in a while. His dad had aged, his hair grayer, his face lined with years of hard living. But there was something different about him. A kind of vulnerability Jake hadn't expected. "Yeah," Jake said, his voice tight. "It's me." His dad stepped aside to let him in, and Jake reluctantly crossed the threshold. The apartment was sparse, just a few mismatched pieces of furniture and the smell of stale coffee in the air. It felt lonely, much like his dad had always been. The silence that followed made Jake uncomfortable, and he wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, his dad broke the silence. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said, sitting down on an old couch and gesturing for Jake to take a seat. "I know I've done a lot of damage, Jake, but I want to make things right. If you'll let me." Jake stood frozen for a moment. He wasn't sure if he should be angry, relieved, or even sad. His dad was here, asking for something he'd never asked for before. Was it genuine, or was it just another desperate attempt to patch things up at the last minute? "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," Jake said, feeling his throat tighten. "You weren't there for me when I needed you the most. You just left. I've had to live with that for years. I know, his dad replied, his voice heavy with regret. And I'm sorry. I can't undo the things I did, but I want you to know I've been trying to change. I've been sober for over a year now, Jake. I know I can't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know I'm trying. I don't expect you to trust me, but I need you to know I'm here, if you're ready. Jake clenched his fists, holding back the flood of emotions that surged through him. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell his dad everything he'd held inside for so long. But part of him felt like the anger was a mask, a way to protect himself from the truth. The truth that his dad was sitting here, asking for a second chance, offering the one thing Jake had always wanted, an apology. Why now? Jake asked, his voice soft but sharp. Why didn't you try before? Why wait until I'm dealing with my own mess to come back into my life? His dad's eyes darkened, as if he knew the weight of his son's question. I've spent a lot of time running from my own mistakes, Jake. I didn't know how to be there for you. I was too busy trying to fix myself, to fix my own mess. But I see now that I hurt you. And I've been carrying that around. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Jake swallowed hard. The words his dad spoke weren't easy to hear, but they were the first step in something Jake had thought was impossible, healing. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive his dad for the years of abandonment, for the hurt he'd caused. But the fact that his dad was sitting there, admitting his wrongs, gave Jake something he hadn't had in a long time, hope. I don't know what to say, Jake said quietly. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you. But I'll give you a chance. A real chance. His dad nodded slowly. That's all I'm asking for, Jake. Just a chance. The air between them seemed to shift. There was still so much to untangle, so much hurt to work through. But for the first time, Jake felt like there was a possibility for something better. He didn't know what the future held, or if his relationship with his dad would ever be what it should have been. But maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to something more than the silence and resentment that had defined their relationship for so long. As Jake left his dad's apartment, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The world hadn't changed overnight, and he wasn't sure how to handle the emotions still swirling inside him. But one thing was for sure, he had taken a step. A difficult, painful step. But a step toward healing nonetheless. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like maybe he wasn't so lost after all. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, his mind still racing after the conversation with his dad. The words his father had spoken echoed in his head over and over, a broken record of regret and promises. Every time Jake closed his eyes, he saw his dad sitting there, pleading for a second chance, offering the kind of apology Jake never thought he'd get. It should have made him feel better, but it only made him feel unsettled. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to sort through the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over him. Anger, disbelief, confusion, and a strange sense of hope. Jake wasn't sure he wanted to hope. He wasn't sure he could. But his dad's apology, his genuine attempt to make things right, had cracked open a door he had long since locked shut. As the night wore on, Jake found himself getting up. He couldn't stay in bed anymore, not with the thoughts swirling in his head. He needed to get out. He pulled on a hoodie and sneakers, grabbed his phone, and headed out the door. The cool night air hit him as he walked out into the quiet street, the silence around him almost deafening. The city was still, but his thoughts were anything but. He felt a tension in his chest that was hard to shake, like something was building inside of him, a storm waiting to break. It wasn't just the conversation with his dad. It was everything. The trial, his past mistakes, the things he had done, the things he still felt guilty for. Jake wasn't sure how to process it all. He walked for what seemed like hours, his feet taking him wherever his mind led him. Eventually, he found himself by the riverbank, standing on the cold stone, staring out over the water. The river was calm, a perfect reflection of the sky above, and yet, Jake couldn't help but feel like the calmness was an illusion. Inside, the storm was raging. He sat down on one of the benches, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low. It was easier to be angry, easier to stay numb. But deep down, he knew that anger and numbness were just masks. They didn't change the fact that the past was still with him. It always would be. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen. It was a text from his mom. "Jake, I'm proud of you. I know today was difficult, but you're making progress. Don't let the past control you. You've got this." Jake smiled faintly, but it didn't last long. The words she sent him were comforting, but they only reminded him of how far he still had to go. He wasn't sure if he could ever truly move on from the past. It felt too ingrained in him, like a part of who he was. "Hey, kid." The sudden voice made Jake jump. He turned to find Sarah standing behind him, her hands shoved into her jacket pockets. She had a way of appearing out of nowhere, always seeming to know when Jake needed someone to talk to. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Sarah. Didn't expect to see you here." She sat down beside him on the bench, her eyes scanning the dark waters in front of them. "I figured you might need some space to think. Or maybe you just needed to get out of the house. I know the feeling." Jake shrugged. "I don't even know what I'm feeling right now." She nodded. "That's okay. You don't need to know exactly what you're feeling. It's enough to just acknowledge it. You've been through a lot, Jake. And what you did today, that was big. Meeting with your dad, giving him a chance to explain himself. It's not easy." Jake let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if it was the right decision, though. I mean, I can't just forget everything he did. I've spent so many years hating him for what he did to me, to my mom. And now he wants to make up for it, after all this time." Sarah's gaze softened. "It's hard. I can't pretend to know what it's like, but I can imagine that being in that position is overwhelming. The anger, the resentment, it's all real. But so is the possibility of healing. That's the part you have to focus on. Whether or not you can forgive him, or even trust him again, that's up to you. But you've made the choice to start the process. And that's a huge step." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It feels like too much, though. I don't know if I can do this. It feels like I'm being asked to let go of so much anger, so much pain, and I don't know how to do that." Sarah turned to face him, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to let go of everything at once. It's a process. It's going to take time. But you're on the right path. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real with yourself. And right now, you're being real. That's something." Jake looked out over the water again, the city lights reflecting off the surface. It was a beautiful sight, but it didn't make him feel any better. He was still carrying the weight of everything, the guilt, the anger, the hurt. The question was whether or not he could learn to live with it, to move forward despite it. "I'm scared, Sarah," Jake admitted quietly. "Scared that if I let go of the anger, I'll forget everything he did. I don't want to forget. I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen." "You don't have to forget, Jake," Sarah said, her voice reassuring. "Forgiving someone doesn't mean you forget what they did. It just means you're not letting it control you anymore. It means you're choosing to heal, not for them, but for yourself." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him. It wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't even about his dad. It was about him, his own healing, his own future. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I needed to hear that." She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Anytime, Jake. Anytime. Jake sat there in silence for a long time, the storm inside him still raging, but a small part of him felt lighter. Maybe the past couldn't be erased, but he could choose how to carry it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step in finding peace. As the night wore on, Jake finally stood up from the bench. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how things would unfold with his dad. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was starting to take control of his own life. One step at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Jake woke up each morning with a gnawing feeling in his chest, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the conversation he'd had with his father. There were moments when he could almost convince himself that maybe it could all work out. Maybe they could rebuild their relationship, piece by piece. But then there were the darker moments, those quiet, solitary hours when the anger came rushing back, raw and unrelenting. He wasn't sure how to balance the conflicting emotions. Was he supposed to be angry? Or was he supposed to give his father a chance, to accept his apology and let go of the past? The answers weren't clear, and each time he thought he had a handle on it, the uncertainty crept back in. That night, as he sat on his bed scrolling through his phone, the screen lit up with a new text message. It was from his mom. "Jake, we need to talk. Call me when you get a chance." Jake hesitated for a moment, feeling his heart rate spike. Something in the tone of her message felt off. It wasn't urgent, but it wasn't casual either. With a sigh, he dialed her number. "Hey, Mom," he said when she picked up. "What's going on?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then she spoke, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you. Something about your dad." His stomach dropped. "What about him?" "I didn't want to tell you this before, but I think you have a right to know," his mom continued. "Your dad, he hasn't really changed. Not in the way he said he has. I found out some things." Jake's pulse quickened, his mind racing with questions. "What do you mean? What things?" His mom sighed deeply, a long, heavy breath that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "I found out that he's been seeing someone, a woman he met while he was still with us. And Jake, he's been lying about his sobriety. I don't think he's been clean like he says he is." Jake's mind spun as his mother's words sank in. His father, lying. After everything? The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. How could his dad do this? How could he be so dishonest, especially after everything they had gone through? The anger surged inside Jake, a tidal wave that threatened to drown him. He clenched his fists, his hands trembling with the fury he felt. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under him. Everything he had allowed himself to believe, everything he had started to hope for, was a lie. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Jake asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jake. I thought you deserved to have some hope, to make your own decision about meeting him. But now I think you need to know the truth. It's your choice how to handle it, but I didn't want you to be blindsided again." Jake sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. His father had been playing him. Again. And he had believed it. He had allowed himself to hope, to think that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But they weren't. They never were. After a long, drawn-out pause, Jake finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Thanks for telling me, Mom. I don't know what to do with this, but I guess I'll figure it out." "Jake, I'm sorry," his mom said, her voice tinged with regret. "I didn't want to cause you more pain. But you have to know the truth. I just want you to be safe." "I will be," Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. As he hung up the phone, the anger continued to swirl inside him. It felt like everything he had tried to build, his hope, his willingness to open up, his desire to heal, had just been shattered. There was no way he could go back to his dad now, not after everything. The trust was gone. But the question remained, what now? The next day, Jake found himself pacing around his apartment, unable to sit still. The night had been restless, filled with angry thoughts and hurt feelings that he couldn't shake. Every time he tried to relax, the reality of what his dad had done slammed into him again. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just keep pretending like things were okay. He needed closure. And that meant confronting his father. After a few deep breaths, Jake grabbed his phone and dialed his dad's number. It rang a few times before it was answered. Jake. His dad's voice was as gruff as it had been the other day, but there was something different about it now. Hesitation. Yeah, it's me, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. We need to talk. There was a long pause on the other end, and then his father spoke, his tone wary. What's going on? Is everything okay? No, Jake said, his voice tightening with anger. I know what's going on. I know you've been lying to me. About your sobriety. About the woman you're seeing. Why didn't you tell me the truth? There was a heavy silence before his dad spoke again, his voice shaky. Jake, I didn't want to hurt you. I thought if I told you everything, you wouldn't want to talk to me anymore. You're damn right I don't want to talk to you anymore, Jake snapped, his heart pounding in his chest. I can't believe you lied to me. After everything, you're still lying. Jake, please, his dad pleaded. I know I messed up. I've made mistakes, and I'll keep making them. But I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know how to make things right. I thought if I could just, I don't know, get things together, that you'd come back to me. That we could fix things. Jake's anger flared up again, but this time, it was more than just anger. It was disappointment. Betrayal. 1,000 emotions that had been building up for years. You've been lying to me for years, Jake said, his voice breaking. And now you think a few apologies are going to make it all okay? I don't trust you. I can't trust you. And I don't think I ever will. He heard his father's voice crack on the other end. I don't know what else to say, Jake. I'm sorry. I really am. Jake's hands shook as he hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation settling over him. It was over. His father hadn't changed. And the worst part was, Jake wasn't sure he ever would. Jake spent the rest of the day in a fog, the conversation with his father still fresh in his mind. He hadn't realized just how much he had hoped for something different, something more. But now, the reality hit him hard. His father's lies, his attempts to manipulate him back into his life, it all felt so hollow. For years, Jake had clung to the hope that one day, things might change, that his dad would show up, ready to be the man he should have been. But that hope had been dashed in a matter of minutes. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most, it was the realization that, in some ways, he had been holding on to a dream. A dream of reconciliation that wasn't meant to be. He had invested so much of himself in the idea of a father who would come through, who would be the kind of man who could rebuild their broken relationship. But Jake knew better now. People didn't change just because you wanted them to. And sometimes, you had to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The apartment felt smaller than usual as Jake walked through the rooms, his feet dragging across the floor. He felt like he was suffocating, trapped in a space filled with all his unspoken emotions. For the first time in a long time, he wished he could just escape. He needed to clear his head, to make sense of everything that had happened in the past few days. He needed to get out of his head. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his spiral. He glanced at the screen, it was a text from Sarah. Hey, you good? Wanna talk? I'm here for you. Jake stared at the message for a moment, a twinge of guilt settling over him. Sarah had always been there for him, through the mess with his dad, through all of it. She knew the pain he had carried for years, and she never hesitated to offer a listening ear. She didn't push him. She didn't try to fix him. She just listened, and sometimes, that was all he needed. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, a lot on my mind." Jake typed back, trying to keep it short. "I know you're lying, but I get it. Call me when you're ready." Jake couldn't help but smile at the text. She knew him too well. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was okay, not when his world felt like it was unraveling at the seams. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. He needed to talk to someone. And Sarah, with her calm presence and understanding, was the one person who seemed to always know how to put things into perspective. The cafe was warm and inviting when Jake stepped inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the soft hum of conversation provided a comforting backdrop. Sarah was already sitting at a corner table, her legs crossed as she sipped her drink. When she saw him, she smiled and waved him over. "Hey," Jake said as he slid into the seat across from her. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Hey yourself. You look like you haven't slept in a week." Jake let out a dry laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah, something like that." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them staring at their cups, the tension in the air palpable. Sarah was the first to break it. "What happened, Jake? Talk to me." Jake sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. "I thought I was doing the right thing, you know. I really did. But, he lied to me, Sarah. Again. I wanted to believe him, but the truth is, I don't think he's ever going to change." Sarah's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his hand. "I'm so sorry. I know how much you wanted it to be different." Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with frustration. "It's not just about what he did. It's about everything. I gave him a chance, I wanted to believe that we could rebuild, but I don't think that's even possible. I can't go back to trusting him. Not after this." "I get it," Sarah said quietly. "You don't have to go back to him. But that doesn't mean you're stuck in this place. You can move on, Jake. You can build something new, with or without him." Jake looked at her, his eyes searching for some kind of comfort. "How do you do that? How do you just, let go of all the years of pain? All the stuff that keeps coming back? Every time I think I've made progress, I'm hit with another truth that just tears me apart." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes focused on him as she spoke. "You don't just let go of everything overnight. It's a process. And you don't have to do it all by yourself. But you do need to choose to let go of the things that are holding you back. The past, the anger, it's not going to do anything for you except keep you stuck in the same cycle." Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with everything Sarah had just said. He hadn't realized it before, but she was right. He had been holding on to the past, letting it control him. And now, it was suffocating him. Maybe it was time to stop letting his dad's mistakes define his future. "You're right," Jake said quietly. "I've been letting all this stuff weigh me down. I don't want to keep carrying it around, but I don't know how to just let it go." Sarah smiled gently. "It's not about forgetting, Jake. It's about forgiving yourself first. You've been through a lot. And you've carried a lot of it on your own. It's okay to not have all the answers. But you need to make the choice to start healing." Jake looked at her, a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't an immediate fix. He wasn't going to wake up tomorrow with all the answers, and he wasn't going to forget the pain. But maybe, just maybe, he could start moving forward. "Thanks, Sarah," Jake said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I needed to hear that." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "Anytime, Jake. You don't have to go through this alone. They sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of everything still hanging in the air. But for the first time in days, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Maybe the past couldn't be erased. But he had the power to decide how he would let it shape his future. The next few days passed in a haze of mixed emotions. Jake went through the motions, work, meals, sleep, never really feeling present, as if he were floating just outside his own life. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, a gentle reminder that the healing process wasn't something that could happen overnight. But even as he tried to focus on moving forward, the anger toward his father still simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any given moment. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, as Jake sat at his desk working on a report, that his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID read, "Unknown." He felt a momentary hesitation. It could be a spam call or one of those automated telemarketers. But something told him this call was different. A gnawing feeling tugged at his gut, so he answered it. "Hello." A familiar voice answered, rough around the edges but unmistakable. "Jake?" Jake's stomach lurched. "Dad?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "Yeah, it's me. I know this is unexpected, but I need to talk to you." Jake's jaw clenched. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be ready for this. But the words had already been said, and now his father was asking for more. It felt like a cruel joke. His father had lied, betrayed him, and now he wanted to talk. It didn't seem fair. "What do you want, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice cold and distant. "I'm sorry," his dad said, the words carrying a heavy weight. "I know I've hurt you. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I've been thinking a lot, and I need you to know something important." Jake felt a chill run through him. He wasn't sure what his father could possibly say that would change anything. The anger he felt was too deep, too ingrained in him to be undone by a simple apology. "Let me guess," Jake replied bitterly. "You've come to tell me that you've changed, that you've realized all your mistakes and you want another chance." There was silence on the other end of the line. Jake could hear his father taking a deep breath. "No, Jake. It's not like that. I'm not asking for a chance. I'm asking for forgiveness. But before you make a decision, you need to hear the truth." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The truth? What could his father possibly say that would make any difference now? "Go ahead," Jake said, his voice laced with skepticism. His father's voice grew quieter, more vulnerable. "You were right. I lied to you. About everything. I've been seeing someone else, yes. And I've been telling you I've been sober, but the truth is, I haven't been. I've been struggling for a while now. But there's something else, Jake. Something I've been holding back. I wasn't just lying to you, I was lying to myself, too." Jake's mind raced. What could he possibly say to this? What more was there to learn? "Dad, you've had your chance," Jake said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I can't keep doing this with you. You've lied to me too many times. I can't keep pretending like everything's going to be okay." His father's voice was filled with regret. "I know, son. I know. But there's something you don't know, and it's important. I didn't just do this to hurt you. I did it because I was afraid. Afraid of being the man I was supposed to be. And I didn't want to face that fear." Jake closed his eyes, trying to keep his composure. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not just struggling with addiction," his dad replied, the words heavy with emotion. "I've been struggling with who I am. The things I did, lying to you, abandoning you, it wasn't just about me being a bad father. It was about me not knowing how to be a man who deserves you as a son. I didn't know how to fix myself, so I just kept running away. Jake's heart twisted. He had heard pieces of this before, his father's self-pity, his excuses, his half-hearted apologies. But something in his voice now was different. It wasn't the same old script. This time, there was raw honesty, pain, and vulnerability. Jake didn't know what to make of it. "I don't know what you want from me, Dad," Jake said, the words coming out almost like a plea. "I don't know if I can forgive you for everything that's happened." "I don't expect you to forgive me, Jake," his father said, his voice cracking. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can do better. I can't change the past, but maybe I can make something better of the future. If you'll let me." Jake stared out the window, his thoughts tumbling over one another. He felt a mixture of anger, confusion, and even a hint of something else, something that felt like hope, buried deep under the weight of all the years of pain. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Jake said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I understand," his father replied softly. "I can't ask for you to trust me. But I can show you. I know I've failed you, and I know I may never be the father you wanted. But I want to try. I want to prove to you that I can be better." Jake exhaled slowly, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be easy. But part of him wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, his father could change. Part of him wanted to believe that there was still a chance for them. "You have a lot to prove, Dad," Jake said after a long pause. "And I'm not going to just jump back in like nothing happened. But I'll think about it. We'll see where this goes." His father's voice softened, a trace of relief in his tone. "Thank you, Jake. I don't expect things to be fixed right away. But just knowing you'll give me a chance means everything." Jake hung up the phone, his hands shaking slightly. He sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the conversation settle around him. The truth was, he didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if his father could change. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive him. But for the first time in a long time, Jake realized that there was a small sliver of possibility. Maybe there was hope for him and his father after all. Jake woke up the next morning with a sense of unease swirling in his stomach. The conversation with his father still lingered, but it wasn't the relief he had hoped for. It was more like a heavy burden. He had been given an opening, a fragile possibility for some kind of future with his father. But the weight of it all, of everything he had lived through, felt impossible to shake off. The day dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last as Jake tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept returning to the phone call. Should he have said more? Should he have just shut it down completely, telling his father there was no point in trying to rebuild something that had been broken for so long? But even as those thoughts twisted inside of him, he couldn't shake the quiet voice that said maybe this time, maybe things could be different. Could he really risk opening that door again? Could he let go of the past, of the hurt, to allow his father back into his life? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt utterly stuck. By the time Jake arrived home that evening, his head was spinning. He hadn't expected his father's phone call to shake him this much. But here he was, sitting on the couch, unable to do anything other than stare blankly at the TV. That's when his phone buzzed again. Another text from Sarah. "How are you holding up? I'm here if you want to talk." Jake smiled to himself. She had been there for him through so much, never pushing him to do anything he wasn't ready for. He appreciated her more than he could say. "It's a lot to process, but I'll be okay." He paused, fingers hovering over the screen. "You were right. I can't keep carrying all this baggage around. I just don't know if I'm ready to take a step forward yet. But I'm trying." A few seconds later, his phone buzzed again. "You don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time, Jake. But remember, healing doesn't happen in isolation. You've got people who care about you. Don't forget that." Jake's eyes stung, a lump forming in his throat. Her words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of his self-imposed isolation. He had been pushing people away for so long, afraid to let anyone get too close. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. "Thanks, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you. You don't have to worry about that. I'm not going anywhere." Jake felt a small smile tug at his lips. Sarah had been a constant, a solid foundation he hadn't realized he needed. The past few days had shown him how much he relied on her, how much he needed the people who truly cared about him. The next morning, after a restless night of sleep, Jake made the decision to call his father back. It wasn't easy. He still felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, his mind spinning with doubt and uncertainty. But the conversation he had with Sarah gave him a little bit of courage, a small spark of hope that maybe there was a way forward, even if it was slow and painful. He dialed the number, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang 3 times before his father picked up. "Jake?" His father's voice was cautious, as if he wasn't sure if Jake would be there at all. "Yeah, it's me," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "I've been thinking about our conversation." His father's breath caught. "And?" Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I don't know if I'm ready to just forgive everything, Dad. But I'm willing to try, to see if we can find a way forward. But it's going to take time. A lot of time. And I need you to understand that." There was silence on the other end of the line. Jake wondered if his father was even breathing. "I get it, Jake. I'm not expecting you to forgive me right away. I know I've hurt you. I'm not asking for anything more than a chance to prove I can be better." Jake closed his eyes, trying to steady his racing thoughts. It wasn't the perfect answer he had wanted, but it was a start. A small one. "All right," Jake said finally. "Let's take it slow. But no more lies. No more games. If we're going to do this, it has to be real. I promise, Jake. No more lies." Jake exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It didn't fix everything. But it was something. A step in the right direction. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions. Jake and his father began meeting for coffee once a week, small conversations at first, awkward, tense, with Jake unsure of what to expect. But each time, his father seemed to be trying. He showed up on time, was open and honest when Jake asked tough questions, and he never once tried to rush the healing process. It was strange. For years, Jake had hoped for something like this, a real, authentic connection with his father. But now that it was happening, he couldn't shake the sense of hesitation. He was learning to forgive, but not without reservations. There were days when the past came rushing back, when the anger and pain threatened to overwhelm him. But each time, Sarah was there, offering him support and understanding. One night, a month after the first phone call, Jake sat down with Sarah at their usual cafe. "I'm not sure if I can keep doing this," Jake confessed, his voice quiet. Sarah looked at him with concern. "What do you mean?" "I'm trying, I really am. But every time I think things are getting better, something happens that pulls me back. I'm scared that I'm going to get hurt again. That he's going to let me down." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his. "Jake, it's okay to be scared. It's okay to take your time. Healing isn't linear. But you're doing the right thing. You're giving yourself the space to feel, to process, and to decide what's best for you. No one can rush you." Jake nodded, taking comfort in her words. The future was still uncertain, and there were no guarantees. But one thing was clear, he was no longer alone in this journey. He had his father, his friends, and Sarah by his side, and that made all the difference. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Jake believed that it was worth traveling. Jake woke up to the dull hum of his alarm clock, the sunlight streaming through his curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. It was a Saturday morning, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't have a pressing deadline or work obligation looming over him. He had the day to himself. But instead of feeling free, Jake felt trapped. Trapped by the weight of his choices, the looming uncertainty of his relationship with his father, and the internal tug-of-war he felt every time he thought about moving forward. The past few weeks had been a series of small victories and setbacks. His father had kept his promise, no more lies, no more pretending. But that didn't erase the years of betrayal and neglect, the countless nights Jake had spent wondering if his father even cared. It was hard to let go of the anger, of the scars that had shaped him into who he was today. Jake got out of bed, running a hand through his messy hair as he walked into the kitchen. He needed something to distract himself. A cup of coffee would do the trick. As the coffee brewed, he stared out the window, his mind running through the same thoughts he had been cycling through for weeks. Could he forgive his father? Could he truly build a relationship with someone who had hurt him so deeply? And, perhaps the hardest question of all, was he ready to forgive himself for carrying so much resentment for so long? The sound of his phone buzzing on the counter broke his thoughts. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Sarah. "Hey, do you want to talk? I'm heading to the park for a walk. I think you could use some fresh air." Jake smiled at the message. Sarah was always there for him, a constant source of support. He was grateful for her, more than she probably realized. "I'll meet you in 30 minutes. I could use the walk." 30 minutes later, Jake was at the park, where Sarah was waiting near the entrance, dressed in her usual workout gear. She greeted him with a warm smile as he approached. "You ready to clear your head?" she asked. Jake nodded, giving her a small smile in return. "I hope so. I've been thinking about everything. About my dad. About what comes next." They began walking down the familiar path that wound through the park. The cool air felt refreshing, and the green trees surrounding them provided a sense of peace that Jake was craving. "You're doing better than you give yourself credit for," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "You're opening up, taking things slow with your dad, and trying to heal. That's not easy." Jake sighed. "I know. But it doesn't feel like enough. There's this part of me that's still angry. And I don't know how to let go of it. Every time we meet, I keep waiting for him to mess up again. I keep waiting for him to prove me right, like he always does. And it's exhausting." Sarah glanced at him, her expression soft but understanding. "It's normal to feel that way. You've been hurt so many times, Jake. Of course you're cautious. But you're also allowing yourself to feel. And that's huge." "I don't know if I can do this," Jake confessed, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. "I want to, but I don't know if I can trust him. I don't know if I can trust myself to handle it." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him. "Jake, you don't have to have it all figured out right now. You're allowed to be uncertain. You're allowed to take time. The important thing is that you're trying. You're not closing yourself off. And that's what matters most." Jake swallowed, the lump in his throat growing. I don't want to keep living in the past. But every time I take a step forward, I feel like I'm pulling myself back into it. I don't know if I'm strong enough to move on." "You're stronger than you think," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've made it this far, despite everything. And I believe in you. I believe you can find your way through this." Jake nodded, appreciating her words more than he could express. She was right. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when he wanted to give up, when the weight of his father's past mistakes would be too much to bear. But he was learning to keep moving forward, even when it felt like his steps were small and unsteady. They continued walking, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rustling of the leaves above. As they reached a bench near a pond, Sarah gestured for them to sit. "Tell me what's going through your mind," she said, her voice gentle. Jake hesitated before speaking. "I'm scared. Scared of being hurt again. Scared of letting my guard down. I feel like if I forgive him, I'm giving him permission to hurt me again. But I don't want to keep carrying this anger. It's wearing me down." "You don't have to forgive him all at once," Sarah said. "Forgiveness doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means you're giving yourself permission to let go of the hold it has on you. You don't need to do it all now. It's a process." Jake looked at her, his chest tight. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive him, but I think I'm ready to start." Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's all you can ask for. One step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers today. You just need to keep moving forward." Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his shoulders begin to lift, if only slightly. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could take another step. Later that evening, as Jake sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on the day. Sarah's words had planted a seed of hope in him, and though he wasn't sure if he was ready to completely let go of his anger, he knew he had to try. It wasn't just for his father's sake, it was for his own peace of mind, his own future. Jake picked up his phone and dialed his father's number. His heart raced, but he was determined to take the next step. His father picked up after a few rings. "Jake?" His father's voice was tentative, like he, too, was unsure of what would happen next. "Yeah, it's me," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been thinking, and I'm not sure where to start, but I think I'm ready to try. Not everything, not all at once. But I'm willing to see where this goes. We'll take it slow. One step at a time." There was a long pause before his father responded, his voice shaky with emotion. "Thank you, Jake. That's all I need. Just a chance." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of his decision settling in. It wasn't going to be easy. But it was a start. And for the first time, he felt like he might finally be able to forgive, not for his father, but for himself. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions. Jake was trying, really trying, to keep his head above water, to navigate the complicated feelings he had toward his father. It wasn't just the anger anymore. It was the weight of expectation, the pressure of doing what was right and trying to rebuild something that felt irreparably broken. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Jake would catch himself staring out the window, lost in thought, wondering if he was making the right choice. He kept hearing Sarah's voice in his head, telling him to take it slow, to give himself time, but the doubts didn't disappear. One evening, he found himself pacing around his apartment. The walls, usually a comfort, felt like they were closing in on him. There was too much silence, too much space for his mind to wander, to replay every conversation, every misstep with his father. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Sarah. "How's it going? You doing okay?" Jake glanced at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys as he debated how much to say. He didn't want to burden her with his frustrations. He didn't want to seem weak. But he knew he couldn't keep this bottled up. Not anymore. "It's harder than I thought. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I keep second-guessing myself." He hit send, then immediately regretted it. It felt like he was complaining, like he was still stuck in the same place. But a minute later, Sarah replied. "I get it. You're doing something really difficult. But that's exactly why you have to be kind to yourself. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take it one day at a time, okay? And don't feel like you have to do this alone." Jake exhaled slowly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. She was right. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Even if it was slow. Thanks, Sarah. I needed to hear that. Anytime, Jake. I'm here, no matter what. And remember, you're not alone. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he reflected on the conversation. It wasn't just Sarah's support that had been helping him get through this, it was his own willingness to try. To let himself feel, to allow the process to unfold. Maybe he wasn't as far along as he wanted to be, but at least he wasn't running from it anymore. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his father. Jake, I know we've only had a few meetings, but I wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance. I know I haven't been the father you needed, but I'm trying to do better. I just hope you can see that. I know it's not easy, but I'll keep showing up. Jake stared at the screen, his heart clenching. He didn't expect his father to reach out like this. It wasn't much, just a few sentences, but it was enough to make Jake pause. For the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a flicker of something real between them. Something worth holding on to. But the question still lingered. Could he trust his father again? Could he allow himself to believe that this time, things would be different? Jake set the phone down and closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise in his mind. The doubts were there, but so was the possibility. It wasn't just about his father, it was about his own healing, about his ability to let go of the past without erasing it. The next morning, Jake decided to reach out to his father. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right thing to do. He wasn't ready to forget, but he was ready to take another step. Dad, I got your message. I appreciate you reaching out. I can't promise that things will be easy, but I'm willing to keep trying, too. One day at a time. He sent the message and set the phone down, his hands trembling slightly. It was a small step. But it was a step nonetheless. The weekend arrived, and Jake decided to take a break from the emotional roller coaster that had consumed him the past few weeks. Sarah had invited him to join her for a hike, and he figured it would be good to get outside, clear his head, and focus on something other than the tension with his father. As they hiked up the trail, the sounds of nature surrounding them, Jake felt a sense of peace that had been absent for a while. The weight in his chest seemed lighter, as if the fresh air was slowly clearing the fog in his mind. I'm glad you suggested this, Jake said, glancing over at Sarah as they reached the top of a small hill. I needed to get out of my own head for a bit. Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that only nature could bring. I thought you could use the break. Sometimes, a little distance from everything helps put things into perspective. Jake nodded, feeling the truth of her words. It was easy to get lost in the daily grind, in the worries and the constant cycle of overthinking. But being outside, in the stillness of the world, reminded him that not everything had to be figured out immediately. Sometimes, you just had to take a step back and let things unfold. As they sat down on a bench overlooking the valley below, Jake felt the tension that had been gnawing at him for weeks begin to ease. He wasn't sure where things were going with his father, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure what the future held. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't do it alone. And with Sarah by his side, and with his father willing to try, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to forgive, to heal, and to finally let go of the past. Jake sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen with little focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the last conversation with his father. His message had been simple, yet the weight of it hung in the air like a cloud that refused to dissipate. I'll keep showing up. It wasn't just words. It felt like a promise, but Jake wasn't sure he could trust it. The one thing he knew for sure was that things were not going to be easy. Healing was messy and unpredictable. His father's attempts to make amends were one step forward, but Jake couldn't help but wonder if they were enough. And how would he know if he was just setting himself up for another heartbreak? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from Sarah. How's your headspace today? I know it's been a lot lately. Jake smiled at her text. She was always checking in, always there with a listening ear or a calming presence when the weight of everything became too much. It's been complicated. Trying to figure out how much to trust, how much to forgive. But I'm doing better. I think I'm starting to come to terms with it, one step at a time. That's good. You don't have to have everything figured out, Jake. It's okay to let things unfold. Just don't rush it. Jake stared at her message, feeling a quiet comfort in her words. He had spent so much of his life rushing, through his work, his emotions, his relationships, that the idea of slowing down, of allowing things to develop in their own time, was foreign to him. But maybe it was time to stop fighting the process. Maybe it was time to let life unfold naturally. He put his phone down and walked over to the window, gazing out at the city. It had always been easy for him to keep moving, to stay busy. But lately, every time he slowed down, he was forced to confront feelings he'd buried long ago. His father, the fractured relationship, the anger that still simmered beneath the surface, it all seemed to surge up whenever he tried to take a break. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Don't rush it. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the weight of his thoughts settle. There was no timetable for healing. There were no shortcuts. If he wanted to move forward, he had to embrace the journey, even if it felt uncomfortable. And it felt very uncomfortable. The following day, Jake met his father for another coffee. This time, they chose a quiet cafe that was tucked away from the bustle of the city, a place where they could sit without distractions. Jake arrived early and found a corner booth, his nerves already starting to flare. He tried to calm himself, reminding himself that this was part of the process. The space between them had shrunk, but it was still fragile. Every conversation felt like walking on a tightrope. His father arrived a few minutes later, looking slightly more worn than usual. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his posture slumped as if the weight of their relationship was wearing on him just as much as it was on Jake. "Hey," his father said, sitting down across from him. "How's it going?" Jake shrugged, unsure how to answer. "I'm hanging in there. It's been a lot to take in." His father nodded, his eyes sincere. "I know. I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time, about how you're not sure where to go from here. I get it. I really do. I've messed up more times than I can count, but I want to make things right. I don't want to keep losing you." Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He had heard his father's apologies before, words spoken in desperation, promises made in moments of guilt. But this felt different. There was a quiet sincerity in his voice, something Jake hadn't heard in years. He wasn't sure if he could trust it yet, but he wasn't ready to dismiss it either. "I'm not sure what making things right looks like," Jake replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "I'm trying to figure that out. It's just, there's a lot of history here, and it's hard to know where to start." His father reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "I know. And I'm sorry for the years of hurt I caused you. I can't change the past, but I can show you that I'm trying. I can be here. And that's all I can promise." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to believe him. He really did. But there was still so much pain and confusion in his heart that it made it hard to move forward. "I don't know if I'm ready to fully forgive you yet," Jake admitted, his eyes focused on the table in front of him. "But I'm trying to be open. And I need you to understand that it's going to take time." His father nodded, his eyes full of regret. "I know. I'll be patient. I'm not going anywhere, Jake." Jake nodded, trying to suppress the feelings welling up inside him. The tension between them was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It felt like a crack in the wall, a crack that, if nurtured, could one day open into something bigger, something better. Later that night, Jake sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on the conversation. He replayed his father's words in his mind. "I'll be patient. I'm not going anywhere." Maybe, just maybe, this time was different. But Jake couldn't ignore the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. The fear that his father's promises would be just like the others, empty and fleeting. He had been hurt too many times before to fully trust again. But there was something about this moment, the sincerity in his father's voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, that made him wonder if it was worth taking a chance. He couldn't control the past. But he could choose how to move forward. One step at a time. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. It was Sarah. "How was your meeting with your dad? I'm here if you need to talk." Jake hesitated for a moment, then typed a response. It was, "Okay. We're not there yet, but it feels like we're starting to move in the right direction. Slowly. That's progress, Jake. I'm proud of you for giving it a chance." Jake smiled as he read her message. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he didn't have to face it alone. Jake woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity that had been missing for weeks. There was no instant solution to the mess with his father, no magic fix that would make everything okay. But somehow, after their conversation the previous day, he felt a small weight lift off his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like there was a way forward, however uncertain it might be. He stood up, stretched, and walked over to the window. The city was already bustling, people rushing to work, cars honking, the usual morning chaos. It was so easy to get swept up in all of that, to forget what truly mattered. But the events of the last few weeks had grounded him. They had reminded him that life wasn't just about the hustle. It was about relationships, forgiveness, and the small moments of connection that made everything else worth it. He grabbed his phone and saw a message from Sarah. It was simple, but it made him smile. "How are you feeling today?" He paused for a moment, considering how to answer. He could easily tell her that everything was fine, that he had everything figured out. But he realized that wasn't the truth. He didn't have it all figured out. In fact, he wasn't even close. But that was okay. That was part of the journey. "I'm feeling better. It's slow, but I think I'm moving in the right direction." He hit send and leaned back against the wall. The uncertainty still lingered, but he was no longer running from it. He was facing it, one step at a time. Later that day, Jake met his father again. This time, they decided to go for a walk in the park, a neutral ground, a place where they could speak without the pressure of sitting in a cafe or an office. Jake appreciated that his father was respecting his need for space, for a slower pace. It wasn't about rushing to make everything right. It was about rebuilding trust, and that wasn't something that could be forced. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the crunch of the gravel beneath their feet the only sound between them. Jake wasn't sure what to say. The last conversation had been raw, vulnerable, but now there was a quiet awkwardness, a lingering uncertainty about what came next. Finally, his father spoke. "Jake, I know I can't fix everything right away," he began, his voice soft. "But I want you to know that I'm here. For whatever it's worth, I'm here." Jake stopped walking and turned to face him. His father's eyes were filled with something Jake hadn't seen in a long time, genuine remorse, yes, but also hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised immediate resolution, but the kind that acknowledged the work that needed to be done. "I don't expect things to be fixed overnight," Jake said slowly. "But I'm trying. I'm really trying. I don't know how to trust you completely again, but I want to try." His father nodded, his face etched with understanding. "That's all I can ask for. I don't have all the answers either, Jake. But I want to work at it, and I want to prove to you that I'm here for the long haul." Jake looked at him, studying the sincerity in his eyes. His father had always been a man of few words, and while the words he spoke now didn't erase the past, they carried weight. He hadn't been a perfect father. Hell, he hadn't even been a decent father at times. But there was something different about him now. Something Jake couldn't ignore. "I'm not going to lie," Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It's going to be hard. But I think I can give this a chance. If we take it slow." "That's all I ask," his father said, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you, Jake. I know it's not easy." They stood there for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like the foundation between them was solidifying, however gradually. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't healed. But it was a start. That evening, as Jake reflected on the conversation, he found himself surprisingly at peace. He wasn't expecting miracles. He wasn't expecting everything to change overnight. But there was a shift, a subtle one that he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way his father had looked at him, the way he had owned up to his mistakes without deflecting or making excuses. Or maybe it was the way Jake had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to admit that he didn't have all the answers either. The truth was, he wasn't sure where this path would lead. But he was ready to walk it, step by step. He reached for his phone again, this time to message Sarah. "I think I'm starting to believe in second chances. It's not perfect, but it's a start. That's all we can ask for, right? A start." Jake smiled as he read her words. He didn't know exactly where his relationship with his father would go, but for the first time, he felt like there was room for it to grow. Room for healing. Room for the future. The following week, Jake found himself back in court. The case with the judge, the one that had set everything into motion, was still lingering in the background. He had been trying to focus on the relationship with his father, but the trial still weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just the case that had him on edge, it was the unpredictability of the situation. The judge's comments, mocking, sarcastic, still echoed in his head. He had been so caught up in his personal life, in trying to make sense of his relationship with his father, that he hadn't fully processed the implications of the case. As he entered the courtroom, he felt a familiar knot in his stomach. He could see the other parties involved, their expressions cold and professional. And then, the judge walked in. Judge Patterson. The man who had humiliated him in front of everyone. Jake swallowed hard as he prepared himself. This was going to be a different kind of fight. But maybe, just maybe, he was ready for it. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Jake sat at his attorney's side, trying his best to keep his composure. It had been weeks since the initial shock of Judge Patterson's mocking comments, and yet, the sting still lingered. He had never imagined that a court case would bring so much more to the surface than he anticipated. Now, it wasn't just about the legal battle, there was a personal vendetta, a sense of needing to prove himself, a need to find justice in a system that had humiliated him. Judge Patterson strode into the room with his usual air of authority. His black robe billowed as he walked to his seat, and everyone immediately stood in respect. Jake could feel the tension rising in the room, like the calm before a storm. His stomach tightened, his mind spinning with thoughts of what had happened the last time he faced the judge. Patterson had mocked him, mocked a teenager struggling to find his place in the world. It was personal. It was cruel. But this time, Jake wasn't going to let it slide. He had too much at stake. As Patterson took his seat and cleared his throat, he fixed his eyes on the docket in front of him, seemingly indifferent to the weight of the case. He was a man who prided himself on authority, and it showed in every move he made. "Let's proceed with the case," Judge Patterson announced, his voice sharp, dismissive. Jake's lawyer, Ms. Jenkins, stood up and addressed the court, her voice confident but with a touch of irritation. "Your Honor, we respectfully request that you revisit the comments made in previous proceedings. We believe they were inappropriate and have affected the integrity of this case." Jake watched as Patterson's eyes narrowed, an almost imperceptible sneer playing at the corners of his lips. He could feel the judge's disdain without needing words to express it. But Jake wasn't backing down this time. He was going to make sure his voice was heard. "Mr. Walker," Judge Patterson said, addressing Jake directly, his tone almost mocking. "I see we've got a young man here who believes he can challenge the system. Tell me, how do you plan to prove that you've been wronged?" Jake felt his pulse quicken. It was as if Patterson was daring him, taunting him to respond. But Jake had learned something important over the past few months: patience. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. His lawyer stepped in, sensing the tension in the room. "Your Honor," Ms. Jenkins continued, "we understand the court's position, but the remarks made were not only inappropriate, they were damaging to my client's character. This court should not be a place for mockery, and we are requesting that any such comments be officially noted in the record as part of the case." Judge Patterson's face hardened, and for a moment, it seemed as if he was about to snap back with a cutting retort. But instead, he leaned back in his chair and paused, his fingers steepling together in a thoughtful gesture. The room fell silent. "I see," Patterson finally said, his tone considerably more neutral. "I will review the record. But I'm not making any promises, Ms. Jenkins." The silence that followed was thick, like everyone in the room was holding their breath. Jake exchanged a look with his attorney. This wasn't going to be easy, but it seemed like the judge was at least taking the request seriously. For the first time in this trial, Jake felt like he had a sliver of hope. As the trial continued, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Patterson's earlier demeanor seemed to soften, if only slightly. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than he understood. He kept hearing whispers from his attorney in the opposing counsel, conversations he wasn't supposed to overhear. Something about procedural delays, loopholes, and legal strategy. The terms were familiar, but their meaning escaped him. It was like a puzzle he wasn't sure he had all the pieces to. After a few more rounds of questioning and back-and-forth arguments, the session came to an end. Jake felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had fought hard, but he wasn't sure whether they had made any headway at all. As the court adjourned for the day, Jake stood up slowly, his body aching from the stress. His attorney, Ms. Jenkins, came over to him. "You did well today," she said with a reassuring smile. "I know it's tough, but you're standing your ground. That counts for a lot." Jake gave her a tired smile. "Thanks. But I'm still not sure if we're getting anywhere." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "There's something strange going on with Patterson. I can't put my finger on it yet, but we're digging into it. Something's off, and I think we're about to uncover something big. Just stay focused, all right?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on with him?" "I'll fill you in once we have more details," she said cryptically. "But for now, just know that this isn't over. We're still in the game." That night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. He spent the evening pacing around his apartment, unable to focus on anything but the case. He had never imagined that his pursuit of justice would lead him down this path, a path that seemed tangled with more questions than answers. Then, just as he was about to go to bed, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ms. Jenkins. "Call me. Urgent." Jake's heart raced as he picked up the phone and dialed her number. She answered almost immediately. "Jake," she said, her voice low and serious. "I've been digging into Judge Patterson's past, and I think we've found something big. Something that could change everything." Jake's pulse quickened. "What is it? What did you find?" "There's a case from a few years ago," she said, her words rapid now, as if she couldn't get them out fast enough. "It was sealed, but we got access to it. It's about corruption, Jake. Serious corruption. Patterson has been linked to a number of illegal activities that were swept under the rug. And I think it's directly tied to this case." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you serious?" "I'm serious," she confirmed. "We're filing a motion to have him removed from the case, Jake. This could be the break we've been waiting for." Jake's mind raced, trying to process the information. If what Ms. Jenkins was saying was true, this could be the key to winning the case, and bringing Judge Patterson's corruption to light. But there was one question that lingered in his mind: was this the beginning of his victory, or was this just another twist in the long, winding road that had brought him here? The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Jake. The revelation about Judge Patterson's corruption was like a bombshell that rocked the entire foundation of the case. His lawyer, Ms. Jenkins, worked tirelessly to prepare the motion to remove Patterson from the trial, but Jake knew this would not be an easy fight. The system was vast and powerful, and challenging a judge of Patterson's stature could lead to serious repercussions. It was a bitter reality. But Jake had come too far to back down now. In the early morning of the hearing, Jake woke up with a familiar knot in his stomach. The weight of everything that had happened, his father's slow return to his life, the emotional upheaval he had weathered, the court battles, the betrayals, and now the hope of exposing a corrupt judge, was almost too much to bear. He had gotten used to the emotional roller coaster, but today felt different. Today, the stakes were higher than ever before. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Sarah. He smiled, a brief moment of light in the storm. "You got this, Jake. Don't let them get to you. You've already come so far." Her words meant the world to him. In the midst of all the chaos, her unwavering belief in him was a steady anchor. After a quick shower, Jake dressed in his usual court attire, nervous, but determined. The drive to the courthouse felt longer than usual. Every stoplight seemed to stretch into eternity, every moment on the road adding to the tension building in his chest. By the time they arrived, his hands were clammy, his mind racing with a million thoughts. When they entered the courtroom, Jake noticed the change in the air. The usual courtroom tension had intensified. The opposing side seemed more guarded, the court staff more serious. Everyone knew that today was no ordinary hearing. The motion to remove Judge Patterson was a game-changer. As Jake sat at his table, he saw Patterson walk in, his face as stone-cold as ever. There was a different energy about him today, though, one that didn't escape Jake's notice. Patterson didn't seem like the man who had mocked him before. Instead, he was guarded, almost apprehensive. Ms. Jenkins stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we're here today to discuss the motion for your recusal from this case. We have gathered substantial evidence, including sealed documents, that suggest you have been involved in misconduct that could potentially affect the integrity of this trial." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Jake held his breath. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. The weight of the situation hit him harder than ever. Patterson stood, his face rigid. "I object to these allegations. They are baseless and have no place in this courtroom." Jake could see the strain in Patterson's eyes. The man was used to having control, but now he was losing it. Ms. Jenkins wasn't backing down. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the evidence we have is substantial. There are connections to criminal activities, money laundering, bribery, and manipulation of judicial decisions, that go back years. These records were sealed for a reason. But now, they are being exposed." Jake's heart pounded as he listened to the back and forth, his eyes fixed on Patterson. The judge's expression was unreadable, but Jake could see the flicker of concern behind his eyes. For the first time, it felt like the scales of justice were finally starting to balance in his favor. The opposing counsel stood up, attempting to push back against the motion. "This is all hearsay," the lawyer argued. "There is no proof that these documents are legitimate. This is simply an attempt to discredit a highly respected member of the judiciary." Ms. Jenkins didn't falter. "We have the proof. And it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world sees it, too." The tension in the room thickened. The judge remained silent for a moment, clearly weighing the gravity of the situation. Jake could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath. Finally, Patterson spoke, his voice measured but tight. "I will consider the motion. However, I will not make a decision today. I will review the documents and make a ruling at a later date." Jake exhaled, his shoulders sinking in relief. The battle wasn't won yet, but this was a huge step forward. The judge had been rattled. The motion had gotten under his skin, and now, there was a real chance that Patterson's corrupt practices would be exposed. As the court session ended, Jake walked out of the room, his heart still pounding but with a new sense of purpose. He had come this far, and no matter what happened next, he knew he had done the right thing. Later that night, as Jake sat in his apartment, reflecting on the day's events, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from Sarah. "Whatever happens, you've already won. You've shown that you can stand up for yourself and for what's right. I'm proud of you." Jake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but at least he wasn't walking it alone anymore. And then, just as he was about to put his phone down, another message came through. This one was from Ms. Jenkins. "Jake, I have news. The judge is being investigated. The motion was just the tip of the iceberg. We've got the documents we need, and the authorities are taking this seriously. Patterson's days on the bench are numbered." Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. Judge Patterson's grip on the courtroom was slipping. The truth was finally coming to light. The battle wasn't over, but the war was won. As Jake lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he thought back to everything that had led him to this point. His father's struggles, his own journey towards self-acceptance, the courtroom battles, the moments of fear and doubt, all of it had shaped him into who he was now. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't invincible. But he was strong. Stronger than he had ever been before. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, Jake knew that he was ready for whatever came next. He had learned something invaluable along the way. No matter how hard life got, it was never too late to stand up and fight for what was right. And in that fight, he had found himself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?